It wasn't supposed to happen, not like that. One stumble, one heartbeat, one accidental kiss, and everything changed. Kathy never believed in fate. She believed in control, in structure, in things that made sense on paper. But that night, that moment, defied logic. It happened so fast that even memory struggled to keep up. A crowded hallway, a misplaced step, and suddenly, her lips brushed against his. Not a soft, romantic movie kiss, no, it was clumsy, real, and startling. Yet in that single, breathless second, the world seemed to fall silent around them. He froze. She did too. Their eyes met, wide and searching, caught between apology and something neither dared to name. The air between them was charged, trembling with confusion and something deeper, something dangerous. "Sorry," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. But Kathy saw it, the flicker of truth behind his words. He wasn't sorry. Not really. And as much as she wanted to be angry, to laugh it off as an accident, she couldn't. Because her heart, traitorous and wild, had skipped a beat too. Outside, the city slept beneath a cold rain. But inside, two hearts beat too loud for silence. Kathy went home that night with trembling fingers and an unsteady breath. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt it again, the warmth of that mistake. It should have been nothing. It should have faded with the night. But it didn't. The memory lingered like a song she couldn't stop hearing, like a spark she couldn't unsee. And somewhere across the city, he couldn't sleep either. His name, a stranger's name that suddenly felt familiar, lingered on her lips. He replayed it all in his mind, the stumble, the surprise, the way her eyes held a story he wanted to read. He told himself it meant nothing. People make mistakes. Accidents happen. But this didn't feel like an accident. It felt like the beginning of something that scared him more than it should. The next morning, Kathy tried to move on. She drowned herself in coffee, in work, in anything that could distract her from the way her pulse quickened whenever she remembered. But every ordinary thing, the reflection in the cafe window, the sound of rain, the way someone said her name, reminded her. It was as if the world refused to let her forget. Two lives that were never supposed to meet now orbited around a single, shared heartbeat. And neither of them could tell where guilt ended and longing began. What do you do when the line between mistake and meaning blurs? When a single moment rewrites everything you thought you knew about love, about control, about yourself? Some stories begin with intention. Theirs began with an accident, one that refused to stay an accident. Was it truly a mistake, or was it fate's quiet way of rewriting their story? I have watched Evelyn for years, though she would never know it, not in the way spies watch or lovers watch, but as someone who notices the soft, steady pattern of a life arranged to keep surprise at bay. Each morning she unlocks the shop with the practiced motion of a ritualist, the metal latch clicks, the bell above the door gives that tired, welcoming jingle, and the city's gray light slides across the same worn wooden floorboards she has polished for a decade. She brews the same coffee in the same chipped mug, leans against the counter, and watches the same faces pass by the window, a student with a stack of used novels, a delivery man with an apologetic smile, an elderly man who reads the paper as if every headline is an old friend. The rhythm comforts her, a careful metronome for a heart that once misread a beat and learned, painfully, how to be cautious. Once, there had been morning plans that reached beyond the shop's brick walls, a fiancé, a ring, a future sketched in bright, careless lines. He left without a goodbye, a single absence where a lifetime had been expected to begin. She learned to fold that absence into the margins of her days until it no longer felt like a wound so much as a scar with its own peculiar tenderness. She mended herself carefully, like one repairs a rare book, with patience, precision, and a humility that never quite surrendered the fear of another page being torn. Evelyn keeps her heart under glass, safe, visible, but not to be handled lightly. Her life, to anyone watching from the outside, is measured and sensible. To Evelyn, it is a quiet covenant with predictability because unpredictability once taught her how sharp the world can be. The neighborhood around her bookshop is the kind of place Rain understands intimately. Streetlights throw puddled halos on cobblestones, and the city smells of wet paper and hot tar in the way old cities always do when they are thinking about storms. The buildings lean together like old friends sharing secrets. The upstairs flats are a patchwork of lives half-lived when the weather is brutal enough. It was in this small, soft-lit world that the disturbance, small, domestic, absurd, began, a new tenant with a name that promised nothing and everything at once. Adrian moved into the flat above the bookshop, a freelance architect whose restlessness seemed to live in the cadence of his steps. He arrived with flat-pack furniture and a stack of sketches, and a quiet sadness lodged somewhere behind his gaze, the sort of sadness that looks polite but carries depth. The first time Evelyn saw him, he was balancing a box of books in the stairwell, the rain finding purchase on his collar. He apologized for the space he took up, as if he were intruding into a life he hadn't meant to want to enter. The first days were polite exchanges, a nod from the window when she swept the stoop, the faint rhythms of him moving above, the scuff of shoes, the muffled laughter of a phone call. The new tenant was always a story in miniature, and Evelyn watched with the kind of curiosity she allowed herself when the stakes felt low. Then the storm came heavy and quick, the kind of storm that makes the city feel like an animal sheltering its vulnerable parts. Rain beat against the shop windows in a relentless percussion, and the sky folded into a wash of iron and glass. The bell above the door rang and rang as people sheltered under coats and umbrellas. The shop smelled of coffee and damp paper, the perfect library breath that comes when two weathered things, books and rain, decide to cohabit. Adrian, in the rush of relocation and installation and the small pride of arranging boxes under his own command, misjudged a step on the narrow staircase that led to Evelyn's shop from the flats. He was carrying a box of drawings, his hands slicked with water, his mind full of angles and lines that wouldn't align. I could see the moment the world narrowed for him, the misstep, the arms flailing for a rail that was just out of reach, the slow-motion tilt of a figure about to be reclaimed by gravity. Evelyn, who had been rearranging a display of dog-eared poetry near the bottom of those stairs, reached out without thinking, a reflex born of living in the same building as the dangerous smallness of human misfortune. Her fingers closed on his sleeve, his body righted, and the two of them found themselves inverted into a closeness neither had negotiated. It is peculiar how clumsiness can feel intimate, the scramble of bodies, the shared breath, the electric shock of skin meeting skin in a way that is accidental and therefore unprepared for. The kiss was not a kiss anyone wrote novels about, not at first. It was an aftershock of the stumble, a mouthful of apology and breath and the faint iron of rain on his collar. They froze as if cut from the same cloth, his eyes wide with apology, hers wide with something that folded in on itself and then expanded. Sorry, he whispered, small and immediate, the word like a soft currency handed across an unsteady table. Evelyn, who had spent years learning the language of restraint, surprised herself by answering with a smile that was more confession than welcome, "You're not." That small exchange hung between them longer than the storm, longer than the moment it had taken to occur. It was as if the city itself had drawn a breath and waited to see what would happen when two lives brushed so carelessly against one another. For both of them, the kiss carried the absurdity of being something that was at once a mistake and a herald. It lodged under Evelyn's ribs like an unwelcome bookmark. She left the shop that evening with the taste of rain still in her mouth and the faint, persistent echo of someone else's breath on hers. Adrian went back upstairs to his half-assembled life and replayed the stumble with the new, obsessive precision of someone who had found a key in a pocket they had never noticed before. Here the moral question anchors itself. What do you do when a small accident threatens the architecture you have spent years building? Evelyn, who had learned to protect, found herself tempted to unbolt a window she had kept sealed. Adrian, who had designed spaces for others and skirted the edges of intimacy, found the straight lines of his solitary life blurred. The city outside resumed its rain-slicked routines, indifferent and vast, but inside the bookshop 2 stories had intersected like pages that would not lay flat. Evelyn's past, the abrupt leaving, the lessons of silence, stood at odds with the sudden longing stirred by a man who had stumbled into her world. She knew, somewhere beneath the warmth that had surprised her, the precarious truth. Opening to this could mean a risk she had no guarantee of surviving. Closing could mean denying a new kind of life the courage to begin. The moral dilemma was not dramatic in the way of thunderclaps. It was a quiet, inexorable force. Trust the tremor of possibility, or fortify the walls one more time and insist that a stumble is nothing more than a stumble. I have watched them move closer in the slow, inevitable way that city lights gather around an intersection, not all at once, not dramatically, but with a steady, accumulating glow that announces itself only when you finally turn and notice how brightly the corner burns. After the storm, the bookshop returned to its habitual rhythms. The bell chimed, the espresso hissed, the same regulars returned like familiar punctuation, and yet something had shifted in the margins of Evelyn's days. The kiss lived in those margins like a footnote that refused to be ignored. It followed her into the shop mornings, folded itself into the steam above her coffee, threaded through the pages she shelved as if some invisible hand had made small notations in the books themselves. It was absurd that a single mistake could demand this much attention, and yet absurdity had become the architecture of her new private weather. Every time the bell rang, the part of her that had learned to hold back wondered if it was him. Every time the rain started she felt the memory like a low pulse under her ribs. Adrian's presence, once incidental and easy to catalogue, became a pattern that insisted on meaning. He found reasons to be downstairs more frequently, a book he genuinely wanted, a map he needed to consult, the promise of a quiet table to spread his sketches. Sometimes he came for coffee and stayed long enough to watch the shop from a chair near the window, as though cataloguing the flow of people was the only way he could practice staying. Their conversations began light, the safe, neutral talk of neighbors, yet beneath each exchange ran an unspoken current. He would ask about obscure authors, about editions he had never known existed, and Evelyn answered with the precise care of someone who arranges words for a living. Their laughter at a mutual joke felt more intimate than either intended. The air between them was taut with all the things left unsaid, the awkwardness of a shared mouth, the ethical knots of other relationships, the old wounds each concealed like bookmarks in their private histories. Evelyn learned, with small and disconcerting clarity, that memory is not always a passive thing. Sometimes it is an active force that rearranges your present until it resembles the past you fear and the future you might secretly want. She told herself, because it was the safest truth, that the kiss was a single event, a stumble turned into an overlong mistake, and that meaning was something she could impose or deny at will. Denial felt clean, it felt like returning a book to its shelf after reading a spoiler you never asked for. But denial also required a violence she had not expected. She would have to be dishonest with herself, to reclassify the awkward warmth that visited her afternoons as nothing more than weather. Every time Adrian lingered by the poetry section, every time his fingers paused over a spine with a hesitation that bordered on reverence, she felt the careful scaffolding of that denial wobble. Guilt arrived as a patient companion. She knew, definitely and finally, that Adrian had someone, had had someone, and the knowledge landed like a stone in her mouth. There were moments she wanted to shove the stone away, to drag it to the shop window and watch it shatter on the pavement below. But that would require motion, and motion required a decision she was not yet ready to make. Adrian too carried his own private gravity. Clara's name belonged to him as casually as a shirt in the closet, as habitually as the pattern of his mornings. He spoke of her, sometimes, with a neutral cadence that made the syllables feel like foreign currency, useful in certain transactions, meaningless in others. They had been engaged, a phrase that hung in the air between them like framed glass, visible, structurally sound, but possibly empty. He did not tell Evelyn about their precise arrangements. He did not volunteer the cracks, the quiet drifting that had made two people who had once promised each other a future into two people who now inhabited separate rooms within the same commitment. But a committed life has pressure points, obligations, visits, the slow accumulation of shared objects that act as anchors, and Adrian felt them pulling at him even as the memory of the kiss tugged in a different direction. The stumble in the stairwell had been an accident, yet accidents can illuminate truths you were not ready to confront. In the days that followed, Adrian catalogued those truths like an architect might examine a building after a quake. He inspected the foundation of his relationship with Clara, he measured the spaces where spontaneity had been removed to make way for predictability, and he discovered that something essential had been eroded. What makes moral choices heavy is not just the weighing of consequences but the intimacy of the weighing itself. Evelyn's options were written in soft pencil in her chest: pretend it never happened, preserve the quiet life she had crafted with such care, or acknowledge the flaring truth and risk everything she had rebuilt. Pretending felt safe because it rendered the world tidy, a neat bookshop with clear divisions between customers, neighbors, and lovers. But pretending required that she lie to the quickness in her fingers when Adrian reached for the same book, to the acceleration of her heart when his hand brushed hers while exchanging change. Acknowledging, on the other hand, promised a different kind of life, messy perhaps, vulnerable certainly, but alive in ways the quiet life had ceased to be. Evelyn's fear of being unwise, of being the woman who opens a book and finds it hollow, sat like an old guardian at the edge of every possibility. Yet what frightened her more was the discovery that she wanted to be courageous in ways she had not considered possible. It is easier to keep a scar secret than to allow someone to trace its edges. Adrian's moral calculus involved a similar but differently angled pain. To be true to himself might mean tearing apart something that, to the world, looked like a future built with deliberate hands. To remain would mean to accept the quiet erosion, to live inside the pattern of a life that was no longer warm. His moments with Evelyn were small rebellions, a conversation about architecture that skirted into a conversation about risk, a shared silence that felt like sunlight. And within those rebellions the accidental kiss matured into a symbol, not of deceit, but of a missing element he had not acknowledged. It became the emblem of what was absent in his day-to-day life: surprise, unpredictability, the kind of closeness that speaks before either person can decide if it is allowed. He started to ask himself questions he had not been brave enough to speak. Can love that begins messy become honest? Is tenderness invalidated by the circumstances of its first expression? Does the fact that a connection began in error make it any less true when it persists? Their interactions accumulated like excuses written in the margins of a page until the page could no longer be read without noticing the scrawl. Adrian borrowed books he had no intention of finishing. He asked Evelyn about obscure printing processes, about the difference between a first edition and a facsimile, as if these small, esoteric questions offered him safe ways to touch the life she had kept carefully curated. Evelyn, for her part, started cataloging instances where she could have turned away and didn't, a shared joke about a minor superstition, a late evening when she locked up and found him waiting beneath the shop light because he had forgotten his keys. Each event could be explained away, disentangled into rational causes and effects, but that would be like insisting a map is the same as a city. The map is useful, yes, but it refuses to hold the smell of rain or the warmth of someone else's breath. Friends, in these stories, rarely appear in time to offer clean advice. When Evelyn's sister called one afternoon, insisting she meet for lunch and promising a listening ear, Evelyn found she had no vocabulary for the particular tangle she felt. How do you explain that the slippery slope you fear is also the only path that suddenly looks like possibility? How do you admit that a mistake might be the one honest thing in a life of polite approximations? Evelyn could not speak these things aloud without the risk of them becoming commands instead of contemplations, and contemplation is an art that requires privacy. So she chewed on questions like bitter candy, the taste lingering long after the last piece was gone. Adrian, in quieter moments, took to sketching again with an intensity that resembled prayer. Lines that once served facades and structures now bent toward the small details of how two people might occupy the same room without stepping on one another's shadows. He drew doorways that opened toward light, he drew balconies that overlooked small streets where rain makes patterns, he drew, absurdly, the bookshop's counter from memory as though it were a shrine. These sketches were confessions without language. He did not show them to Clara, perhaps out of cowardice, perhaps out of the instinct to keep something delicate private until he understood its edges. And so the moral crossroads remained unsettled, a junction where neither path felt definitively right. The pull toward safety pressed with the weight of years, the pull toward honesty shimmered with the dangerous appeal of something new. They both stood there, in their separate but overlapping orbits, testing the gravity. Each coffee shared, each lingering glance, was a decision disguised as habit. Each small, honest laugh was a vote cast in the quiet election of the heart. The city outside continued its indifferent spin, shopkeepers delivered parcels, trams hissed, and rain kept making the same patient conversation with the pavement. But inside the bookshop, the arithmetic of consequence had multiplied into something less predictable, a net of feelings that caught them both, resisting the tidy classifications they had once relied on. At night, when the shop lights dimmed and the world took on a softer, more truthful tone, Evelyn would stand alone among the stacks and try to imagine what it meant to choose. She could imagine a life where she stayed within walls she knew, where her scar remained honored in solitude. She could imagine, too, a life unraveled into new patterns, where each day might be less safe but somehow more luminous. Adrian would climb his stairs and stand at his window looking down at the bookshop's faint glow and question whether the courage to choose would ever be his. The moral tensions did not resolve into neat answers, they accumulated into a weight that neither could ignore. The kiss, once an accident, had become the hinge on which both their futures might swing. And the question that lodged between them, like a seed that had not yet decided whether to sprout, was not merely whether they should be together, it was whether they had the bravery to admit what their small, accidental moment had revealed about their hunger for something truer. I have watched the day the map of their lives folded over itself, a crease so precise it seemed almost intentional, and I know the exact way the light fell through the shop window that morning, cutting the room into a strip of gold as if to spotlight the small betrayals that truth so often reveals. Clara discovered something that had nothing to do with stolen kisses and everything to do with neglect. It arrived not as a dramatic confrontation but as a quiet accumulation, missed dinners, texts that came late and short, the blank spaces in conversations that had once been filled with plans. She found the missing pieces not in a single file or a single proof but in the way the apartment echoed, in how Adrian's laughter no longer filled their kitchen, in the way his belongings kept the shape of someone who existed mostly elsewhere. The discovery was the kind that breaks in slow increments, a vase each day with a hairline crack that eventually makes a nice, clean collapse. When Adrian sat with Clara to confess, he did not reach for melodrama. There was no furious speech, no flinging of old receipts as proof of abandonment. There was, instead, a trembling honesty, the kind that sounds like furniture being moved carefully in the dark so as not to wake whatever sleep still lives in the room. He told her, in clipped, honest sentences that surprised him with their clarity, that he had been dishonest about the only thing that mattered, the state of his own heart. He admitted not to a betrayal of the body but to a betrayal of presence. He spoke of a loneliness that had nothing to do with Clara's worth and everything to do with his own inability to be where he was. That confession was an awkward kindness, it did not excuse him, but it removed the possibility of ignorance. Clara listened, and in the listening the scales shifted. She had, for a long time, tolerated the small erasures, the tiny compromises of two people who had once promised a shared future. What she would not tolerate, it seemed, was being asked to inhabit a life half-offered. The conversation ended not with fury but with a soft, practical clarity. Some things cannot be repaired by apology alone. Evelyn discovered the other piece of the puzzle the way you always discover the most intimate betrayals, by accident. She had been cleaning out a box of old photographs in the bookshop's attic, a small ritual she used to remind herself she had a past beyond the store. The box contained years of faces, a teenage Evelyn with a chipped tooth and an oversized sweater, a graduation photo where she looked as if the future was a line she could walk across without falling, a stack of Polaroids with friends and silly captions curled in the corners. One photograph slid loose and landed on the floor with the kind of sound old paper makes when it remembers being handled. There, in yellowed gloss and a stadium of summer, was Clara, younger, of course, her hair shorter, her expression the same, and beside her, arm in arm, a girl Evelyn had loved like a sibling in the weathered certainty of youth. They had been inseparable once, before the world demanded adult arrangements, before people drifted for reasons that made sense only in retrospect. The name on the back, written in a child's hand, confirmed what memory had hinted. Clara had been the friend who vanished after high school, the sister of choice who disappeared into adulthood with promises Evelyn had kept in the bottom drawer of her heart. The photograph split Evelyn from the inside. The discovery felt like walking into a room and realizing the portrait on the wall was of someone you once shared a secret with. The revelation did not simply complicate the story, it rendered it messy and human in a way that honesty often does. She understood, in the small, terrible clarity memory provides, that the man she was being drawn to, the man whose breath she could still taste on the back of her teeth when she closed her eyes, belonged, in some earlier life, to someone she had once loved like a sister. The feeling was not possessive, not in the childish sense of ownership, but intimate enough that the sensation of encroaching on an old place of tenderness felt like treason. Evelyn had kept a portrait of Clara in the softest corner of her memory, untouched by bitterness. To see that portrait now, and to realize it was tied to the man who had stumbled into her arms, was to feel the ground tilt under her feet. I could see how each decision that followed felt weighted with the particular gravity of things that should not be trifled with. Adrian's confession to Clara had been an attempt to be kind, to be fair in a way he had not been when he let the quietness creep into his life. Clara's reaction, a composed, sorrowful exit rather than an enraged spectacle, broke them both in a quiet way that left no room for theatrical recoveries. Evelyn, upon seeing the photograph, recoiled inward. She closed the shop for days, and the bell that usually announced her presence went unsung. People who had come to count on the bookshop's steady hours found the door locked and a small handwritten note on the frame, closed for personal reasons. It was an honest, blunt statement that concealed more than it revealed. Evelyn needed the silence to arrange the chaos. She needed to be somewhere that was not watched. Adrian, in turn, discovered the absence of the bookshop in his life like a missing limb. He climbed the stairs to the flat above and found the apartment oddly large, like a second stomach he hadn't realized he'd been feeding. He left messages on Evelyn's phone, small, awkwardly polite notes that tried to ask for forgiveness while also extending a hand, but she did not answer. The unanswered phone calls multiplied, each one a small sharp stone dropped into the well of his conscience. He began to understand the cost of what he had begun. The thing that had felt like possibility when it was fresh on his tongue now seemed dangerous and fragile. He wanted to speak to Evelyn, he wanted to explain, to say that the photograph had not been a knife but a mirror, that none of this had been premeditated, that he did not want to hurt anyone. Yet the more he wanted, the less capable he became of choosing words that would be enough. They finally met not with words but with silence, a silence so full of meaning it seemed louder than any argument. The bookshop was open again, the bell resuming its tired song, but everything had been warped by absence. Evelyn stood behind the counter as if that were an island she could retreat to. Adrian came in with the slump of someone carrying regret as if it were a physical weight in a bag. They looked at each other, and for a moment neither spoke. The world shrunk to the distance between them, a counter, a coffee cup left half full, the faint smell of lemon polish. The silence between them was not passive, it was active, shifting like weather. It carried the memory of the kiss, the escalation of guilty conscience, the photograph, the confession to Clara, the closed days. It was a silence that contained the ability to wound or to heal depending on what happened next. At last Adrian said, in a voice that felt like a borrowed shade of courage, that he was sorry for the way things had been handled. He did not defend the emptiness he had allowed in his relationship with Clara, he acknowledged it, and that acknowledgement sounded both brave and bankrupt. Evelyn, whose life had taught her the careful management of hope, found her own voice small and linear. It was an accident, she said softly, not because she wanted to diminish what happened but because naming it as something else would mean stepping into a moral space she was not yet certain she belonged in. But I keep wishing it wasn't. The words were at once a confession and an indictment, they were both an admission of desire and a recognition of the danger it posed. Saying them aloud made them real in a way that had nothing to do with theater. They were not lines meant to be resolved easily, but rather the raw, honest truth of two people trying to navigate an impossible geometry. This was no simple love scene where one could neatly separate right from wrong. The photograph had rendered their ethical landscape more complex. Evelyn's childhood friendship with Clara meant that every step they considered taking would be evaluated not just in terms of their present feelings but in relation to bodies of past loyalty, remembered tenderness, and unspoken debts. Evelyn's silence had been a kind of self-preservation. It was an attempt to step back and let the dust settle in a way that might allow for clearer sight. Adrian's restlessness, once merely a personal flaw, now felt like a moral choice with consequences that stretched beyond him. Clara, in her leaving, had chosen a kind of dignity that refused to be a mere victim. She had turned away not because she was weak but because she refused to be the seam that held together a garment no longer fitting. Love born from a mistake does not arrive as a tidy paradox, it arrives like an afterimage, something formed from a brief flash that refuses to be dismissed. The question we all ask then is not only whether such love can be pure, but whether purity is the right measure of worth. Must love be born from immaculate intention to be valid? Or can love that begins messy, that begins imperfectly, reveal truths about two people that, once out in the open, can be tended to with honesty? Evelyn and Adrian found themselves at the center of this query. The photograph complicated any simplistic notion of courtship because it invoked a history that demanded consideration. Clara had been the friend who mattered, the girl who had taught Evelyn how to hold someone's secret as if it were a fragile manuscript. To take away from that girl now would feel like stealing a chapter of a life Evelyn had once shared. The moral landscape had become layered, with loyalties stacked like card houses that could collapse if touched too quickly. Adrian, meanwhile, found his own reflection in the polished wood of the counter he was leaning on. He saw a man who had allowed inertia to become his relationship, who had confused comfort for contentment. The revelation of Evelyn's connection to Clara did not absolve him of blame. If anything, it intensified the gravity of his choices. He could not point to the photograph and say, "See, fate made this complicated," and then walk away. Fate rarely offers a carte blanche for human responsibility. The photograph, Clara's departure, Evelyn's withdrawal, these were all events that demanded moral reckoning. They asked questions about how to love without erasing others, how to be present without being selfish, and whether the honesty of confession could be a bridge rather than a sword. When they left the shop that evening, they did not walk away holding hands or plotting a future. They walked away with the faint scent of books on their clothes and the awareness that what had begun as an accident had changed the axis of their lives. The city continued outside, indifferent in a way that was both cruel and merciful. People huddled under umbrellas, taxis splashed through puddles, neon signs hummed. Inside, their lives had become a small geography of choices where every road promised a different kind of loss. The revelation had not given them clarity, it had given them the harder gift of truth. Truth, once spoken, is rarely romantic in the way novels make it seem. It is complex, it is heavy, it demands action. It forces you to choose which parts of yourself you will keep and which you will leave to the rain. So the question remained, lodged between them like an unread book on a shelf: can love born from a mistake still be pure? Or are some moments too fragile to survive the truth? They had no clean answer. What they had instead was intimacy reconfigured by responsibility, desire complicated by history, and an understanding that if anything good could come from this, if honesty and courage could converge, it would not be because the kiss was blameless, but because the people involved were brave enough to name what had happened, to accept the harm caused, and to decide, in full awareness of past ties and future consequences, who they wanted to be. The revelation had not resolved them, it had shown them the terrain they would have to cross if they hoped to find a kind of love that could be held up to the light and still look whole. It was the kind of night the sky forgot how to breathe. Rain pressed against the glass of the city as if trying to wash something away, maybe guilt, maybe memory, maybe the thin line between what was meant to be and what simply happened by accident. I watched it all unfold as though the world itself was holding its breath for two people who had both run out of excuses and places to hide. The city glimmered under the storm's hand, streetlights trembling like tired stars. And somewhere in that wet silence, two souls stood at the edge of a choice that would undo or define them. Evelyn had packed her bags quietly. Not dramatically, no rushed tears, no slammed doors. Just the deliberate, quiet motions of someone who has decided to leave without fanfare. The bookshop had been her sanctuary, her self-made cathedral of control, but now it felt like a room that echoed too much of him, his voice in the aisles, his shadow between the stacks, his name folded somewhere between her ribs. So she locked the door, handed the keys to the landlord for temporary closure, and walked into the city's rain without knowing where she was headed. The station, she thought, was as good a place as any for people who don't know where they belong. Adrian found out the way people often find the truth, too late. Clara was gone, her departure had been quiet, dignified, and final. A single note, nothing cruel, just a sentence that left him hollow. I hope you find the courage to stay where your heart already is. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was a kind of grace, the kind that sets a person free whether they deserve it or not. He had spent weeks avoiding mirrors, avoiding his own reflection because he couldn't stand the man he saw. He had built his life on blueprints and order, but love, real love, had no measurements. And Evelyn, she had been the one variable he hadn't accounted for. She was chaos disguised as calm. A woman who never asked for him, yet somehow saw through him. He found himself walking without purpose until purpose found him. The rain was relentless, the streets glossy with reflections, and the train station loomed like a confession waiting to happen. He didn't know how he knew she would be there. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe guilt. Or maybe love, that irrational compass that points you toward the one person you can't seem to unlearn. Evelyn sat by the platform window, her suitcase beside her, the world blurring behind streaks of rain. She looked tired in a way that only emotional honesty can make someone look raw, unguarded, beautifully human. When Adrian appeared, drenched, breathless, she didn't turn right away. She knew the rhythm of his footsteps by now. She could have pretended not to notice. But she didn't. He stopped in front of her, rainwater dripping from his hair, his clothes clinging to him like pennants. For a long time, neither spoke. The station hummed around them, a distant announcement, the screech of train wheels, the pulse of strangers moving past. It was a moment suspended between heartbeats. "You were the first thing that felt like home," he said finally, his voice shaking but sure. "Not a place. Not comfort. Just, you. I didn't plan it, Evelyn. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. But when it did, it was like the world had been waiting for me to notice you." She closed her eyes for a moment, the words like salt on a wound she wasn't ready to let heal. "Then why does home hurt this much?" she asked softly. Her tone wasn't bitter. It was worse, it was tender. It was truth, unarmed and unguarded. He stepped closer, hesitant, as though the space between them were sacred and dangerous all at once. "Because I broke it," he said. "Because I came to you half alive. I thought I could build something honest from the ruins, but I was still standing in the ashes of who I used to be." She turned then, really turned, and looked at him. His eyes were tired, but there was no deceit in them, just a man stripped down to honesty. She wanted to forgive him. God, she wanted to. But forgiveness isn't the same as return. Love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes love is the ability to let go before it becomes another wound. "You don't get to save yourself by loving me," she said. "I can't be the reason you walk away from what's broken. You have to do that on your own." Her voice didn't tremble. It was calm, almost too calm. The kind of calm that follows the storm, when everything inside has already been decided. Adrian's throat tightened. "Evelyn, please." But she shook her head, a sad, soft motion. "No. You needed to find yourself, not lose yourself in me. What happened between us, it wasn't a lie, but it wasn't ready to be the truth either." The train's whistle pierced the station, sharp and final. She stood, lifted her suitcase, and looked at him one last time, not with anger, not even regret, but with a kind of reverence. "You made me remember what it felt like to be alive again," she said. "And maybe that's enough." He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, to promise her that he could make things right. But promises, he'd learned, were only as strong as the people who keep them. And right now, he wasn't strong enough. So he let her walk away. The doors closed between them with a hiss that sounded almost like a sigh. He stood there long after the train had vanished into the rain, his reflection trembling in the glass. For the first time in years, he didn't try to fix what was broken. He simply let it be. Evelyn didn't go far, just far enough to breathe again. She stayed with a friend in another city, a quiet place by the river, where the air didn't smell of regret. She spent her mornings reading and her nights thinking of the things she'd never said aloud. Some days she missed him so much it felt like a physical ache, other days, she felt peace, like she'd finally stopped fighting gravity. Weeks passed, and the rain in the city eventually gave way to sunlight. The bookshop reopened under a sky that seemed newly washed, though the sign still bore faint streaks from the storm. Evelyn dusted the shelves, rearranged the books, and brewed the same familiar coffee. But something was different. She moved slower, smiled easier, spoke softer, as though she'd made peace with all the versions of herself she had once been afraid to face. People returned. So did the quiet rhythm of her days. And though she never said his name, sometimes, when the evening light slanted through the window just so, she felt the echo of his voice, not haunting, just present. A reminder that not all endings are meant to erase. Some are simply meant to make space for new beginnings. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. No return address. No name. Just her own handwriting on the envelope, where she'd once written her business address on a borrowed piece of stationery. She frowned, turned it over, and opened it carefully. Inside, a single line. "Sometimes the universe trips us, just to make us fall into love." That was it. No explanation. No signature. Just that one line. Evelyn smiled, not the kind of smile that reaches the eyes immediately, but the slow, quiet kind that begins somewhere deep, where pain has already softened into understanding. She placed the letter inside a book near the counter, between the pages of The Great Gatsby, and went back to work. Because life, she had learned, doesn't always offer closure. Sometimes it just gives you small mercies, the ability to breathe again, to love again, even if from afar. As for Adrian, I watched him begin again, too. He didn't return to Clara, though she left the door of civility open. He didn't run to Evelyn either. He moved into a smaller apartment across town, with fewer windows and more silence. For months, he worked, not to distract himself, but to rebuild. He stopped sketching buildings for other people and started drawing for himself again. He drew rain. He drew trains. He drew the silhouette of a woman standing beneath a streetlight, head tilted up toward the storm. He mailed that drawing one day, unsigned, to a small bookshop with a blue door. It was his way of saying what words could no longer carry: "Thank you for reminding me who I am." He didn't expect an answer, and none came. But somehow, that felt right. Because love, real love, is not always about arrival. Sometimes it's about what remains after the leaving. The space that still hums when two people have touched something larger than themselves. So, in the end, what became of them? They continued. Separately, quietly, but not sadly. Evelyn's bookshop grew busier that year. Locals began calling it the Rain Room, a place where stories washed away old hurts. And Adrian's work, his new designs, his sketches of movement and stillness, caught attention for their strange, emotional precision. People said his buildings felt alive, like they remembered something. Neither of them spoke again. But sometimes, when the first drops of rain hit the city glass, both of them, wherever they were, would stop what they were doing, close their eyes, and smile. Because in that instant, they could almost feel the echo of that first clumsy, impossible kiss. Not regret. Not longing. Just remembrance, the kind that doesn't hurt anymore. And maybe that's what love really is. Not the grand gestures. Not the perfect timing. But the quiet, lingering truth that some people arrive not to stay, but to change the temperature of your soul, to wake you, to make you stumble, to make you feel again. Evelyn had once believed love was about holding on. Now she knew it was also about letting go. Adrian had once thought love was about safety. Now he understood it was about courage, the courage to choose truth over comfort, even when the truth leaves you standing alone in the rain. The city went on, unaware of the story it had quietly hosted. The trains kept coming and going. The bookshop stayed open late some nights, the windows fogged with the breath of readers lost in borrowed worlds. And sometimes, when the bell above the door rang, Evelyn would look up, half expecting to see him, not because she wanted him to walk back in, but because part of her would always recognize him in every shadow that reminded her how far she'd come. Love, after all, is not about destiny. It's about moments, fragile, imperfect, unforgettable moments, that change the direction of our lives. And sometimes, the universe really does trip us. Just to make us fall into love. I have watched the small mercies of ordinary days gather around Evelyn like soft light, patient and unassuming, until they braided themselves into something that looked a lot like peace. Months had passed since the train station, long enough for rainstorms to come and go, long enough for the city to wear new coats of weather that settled differently on its shoulders. The bookshop had reopened in a quieter way, as if the room itself had decided to breathe more slowly and more deliberately. Evelyn moved among her stacks with the ease of someone who had learned how to hold both grief and gratitude in the same hand. The bell over the door kept its small, familiar jingle, regulars resumed their habitual patterns, the student with the heaps of novels arrived on Thursdays as if time had agreed to go on as it always does. This continuity was not the same as forgetting. It was better, it was the art of living after damage, where the past is a room still visited but no longer lived in. Adrian's absence had been a season in itself, an ache that softened, then reshaped into something more useful. He had not returned in a dramatic flourish nor with a suitcase of apologies. His return was quieter, like someone stepping back into the light after learning how dark can be navigated. He had written, briefly, and then stopped when he realized letters sometimes asked for things they could not ethically request. Clara's life had settled elsewhere, and she had offered him a civility that left him free but not unscarred. He had used the distance not as an escape but as a place to grow. The restless architect learned to listen to the spaces he inhabited, not just to impose design upon them. He sketched less for show and more for discovery. He remembered how to be present in small ways. He learned how to make tea that wasn't merely hot water in a cup, how to read a room without trying to rearrange it, how to stand and not be the center of everything. The day he walked back into the bookshop, not storming, not chasing, but entering as if to see what had become of a place he once loved, the bell rang and the light fell through the window at the exact angle that made dust visible, and I felt something shift that was less seismic than it was inevitable. He sat where sunlight pooled like an old friend, the same quiet gravity about him as before, but the edge of him had changed. There was an ease in the way he held the book now, a measure of contentment that comes from having learned how to be comfortable with the company of your own thoughts. Evelyn looked up and saw him, and rather than a lot of things, recrimination, a demand for explanation, the sudden reactivation of a past wound, what circled them was a gentle, mutual recognition. It was like two actors who had once improvised a scene and now found themselves back on a stage where the lines were differently lit. No one made a dramatic entrance. The silence between them was not an absence of meaning, it was a dense presence that contained a history no single sentence could render without doing some violence to its nuance. Adrian's eyes flicked to her. A small smile passed between them like a greeting meant for two people who had weathered something together and emerged with the knowledge that survival does not always require reunion. He closed his book slowly and placed it on the table as if to say, in action rather than words, that some chapters close and others remain open. Evelyn's hands, the hands that had once steadied a falling man in a stairwell, rested near the cash register, idle. She felt all the old currents, the remembered warmth and the new, careful distance. They did not speak. Sometimes, I think, the loudest confessions are made without sound, the way two people look at each other and understand what cannot be unlearned, and accept it. There were moments during that afternoon that folded like paper cranes, delicate, exact, and fragile. A customer asked a question about a particular book and Evelyn answered, but the cadence of her voice carried an ease that had not been there before. Adrian lifted a cup of coffee and watched the steam rise, thinking perhaps of the quiet months that had taught him how to stay. Several times their hands approached the same place, near a shelf, by a book spine, and retracted with a polite choreography that felt almost like respect for the small treaty they had made with each other and with the people they had once been. The near touches were the kind of thing that people who love without the expectation of possession practice, the willingness to be close without claiming, to be near without needing to anchor. Later, as the shop emptied and the afternoon softened into the kind of dusk that makes the room feel like a private theater, they spoke. Not of the kiss, it was a subject that had become a private constellation. Naming it aloud felt unnecessary because both had already inhabited its consequences and learned from them. They spoke of minor things, a book Adrian recommended to a patron, a peculiar edition Evelyn had found in a donation box, the small domesticities that, when shared, become the scaffolding of friendship. Their conversation had a new texture, depth but not desperation, honesty without the entreaty to repair. When Adrian said something that used to be the sort of flippant charm that might have once tried to sell reconciliation, Evelyn listened and smiled in a way that acknowledged the man without erasing the past. He smiled back with the humility of someone who had learned that to be loved requires a capacity for self-reckoning. The kiss, that surviving ember from their earlier life, lingered like a secret hanging between the stacks. It had not been erased by time nor made clean by distance. It had become a part of their story, a strand woven in with others that gave the tapestry different colors but did not define the whole. There were pauses where their eyes met and held, small references to a shared moment that both knew and did not need to recount. In those pauses, the past was present but not commanding. It existed like the afterglow of a sunset, beautiful and quiet, a reminder that something luminous had happened and that the world continued regardless. Evelyn found, in those weeks and months, that she could hold two truths at once, that the accidental kiss had been meaningful, and that meaning did not obligate her to surrender herself to its consequences in ways she did not want to accept. She had learned to be patient with herself. Patience, as I have seen it, is not passive. It is an active cultivation of stillness that allows a person to discern what they truly want rather than what their heart, in panic or pleasure, might momentarily desire. She was no longer the woman who sealed her heart behind glass and expected no one to touch it. She had, instead, a tempered openness. She knew how to let things arrive and depart without equating movement with loss. She had put down the heavy burden of defining everything as either salvation or ruin. This neither trivialized the past nor magnified it into absolute tragedy. It simply allowed her to continue. Adrian's own interior transformation had been less dramatic in spectacle and more decisive in interiority. He had ended his engagement because he realized that fidelity was about more than ritual, it required an authentic heart and presence that he had not been giving. He did not leave to pursue Evelyn. He left because he could no longer justify asking someone else to live in the husk of a man still figuring out how to stand. In doing so he made room, for both of them, which, I believe, was the most honest act either of them could have performed. He had learned that true courage was not in seizing what you wanted, but in relinquishing what you were not prepared to honor. Months folded into seasons. The shop collected a normal kind of bustle, readers recommended books to one another, students sought quiet corners to study, and the owner became, in a way that is never planned, the steward of other people's small lives. Adrian returned intermittently, sometimes to buy a book, sometimes to sit and sketch near the window, sometimes to simply watch the shop breathe. Their interactions never went back to the fevered intensity of those early days. Instead, what grew between them was a companionable understanding, a shared language of nods and references and respectful distance that felt, to them both, like a truer form of intimacy. It contained gratitude for what had been learned and for what had been sorrowed. It refused the simpler narratives of triumph or defeat. And then, a curious thing happened. One evening, while the shop hummed with the low conversation of a book club on the upper floor and the city outside prepared for its night rituals, Evelyn found a small envelope tucked beneath a neatly stacked pile of returned books. It was the sort of anonymous kindness that literary places sometimes attract, quiet notes left to be discovered like little gifts. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with a line written in a familiar, careful hand: "Sometimes the universe trips us, just to make us fall into love." She smiled in the way that people smile when something private is affirmed in a public place. The line was not a command, not an insistence. It was a gentle suggestion, a kind thought, a fragment of philosophy that allowed her to place their story back into the larger, strange continuity of human lives. They never framed the kiss, they did not write an explanation to pin above the counter. The past remained as it is, a part of them, acknowledged and then set beside other things. The truth of it, whether it had been accident or fate's small nudge, was a query they allowed to hang in the air without demanding an answer. It was simpler, and more humane, to dwell in what the experience had taught them, how to be kinder to themselves, how to practice honesty, how to let go when that was the right thing to do, and how to receive the kindness of another without confusing it with ownership. There were things left unsaid, naturally. Books are full of those, ellipses and parentheses of unspoken life. Evelyn never asked Adrian if he had loved Clara in the way she had loved him, and Adrian never pressed Evelyn to define whether the kiss had been destiny or mistake. These silences were not avoidance, they were respect for the complexity of human hearts. They had seen how the blunt force of explanation could annihilate tenderness, and they chose, instead, the quiet politics of preservation. In that preservation, they founded a concise and resilient form of intimacy, one that did not need a confession to survive. Love, they learned, is often a study in small continuities rather than grand finales. It can be a smile exchanged across a shop, a book recommended with a knowing glance, a silence shared that feels warmer for being mutual. It can be patience practiced like a craft, not as an abdication of feeling but as the discipline of holding possibility without forcing its hand. The greatest gestures are not always fireworks but the cumulative small mercies that make a life habitable. So the shop remained a place where stories were read, borrowed, and sometimes returned with marginalia, where the air smelled of coffee and paper and an underlying quiet. Adrian and Evelyn continued, not as lovers in the conventional sense, not as strangers either, but as two people who had once intersected in a way that changed them irrevocably. They traded glances that were not always easy to translate, and occasionally they let their hands hover near each other on a shelf before withdrawing with a smile that acknowledged both desire and restraint. It felt like a covenant of mutual care: we will not dismantle each other, we will allow the other to exist with dignity, even when the past has taught us how precarious that dignity can be. And in the end, I have watched them live with the lasting question like a bookmark between the pages of their lives: was that kiss a genuine accident, or did the universe, in its strange and crooked wisdom, nudge them towards something they needed to see? Were some beginnings wrong because of their timing, or could a heart honestly discover itself even when it began in error? There are no tidy answers to hand down. What remains is the way they moved in the world afterward, not clinging, not fleeing, but continuing, patient, attentive, and capable of holding more than one truth at a time. If anything, their story taught me that love's legitimacy is not measured by immaculate origins. It is measured by the care with which people tend to the consequences of desire, by the courage to alter a life when it causes harm, and by the capacity to keep compassion and honesty in conversation. The kiss lingered, yes, like a scent in a room after someone has left. But it did not define them. It informed them, like a lesson learned in private, and then they went on to be better readers of one another and of themselves. So the shop stayed open. The bell continued to sing. The city went on washing itself with rain, and people kept looking for stories that might change them. Evelyn shelved books with more grace than before and smiled sometimes at nothing in particular. Adrian sketched in his quiet hours and sent an occasional insign drawing that found its way to the shelf. And the kiss, neither confessed nor condemned, lived on in the pauses between sentences, in the almost touches, and in the steady, patient way two people learned to be kind to the past while making room for a future that was honest, whatever shape it might take. If this story touched you, if you've ever believed that life's accidents might be fate in disguise, take a moment to share this story. Tell us what you think in the comments. Was it truly an accident, or something more? And if you want more stories that remind us how fragile, messy, and breathtaking love can be, subscribe to CineVerse Stories. Because sometimes, the smallest moments change everything.